Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are once again covering the National March on the White House that took place March 16th. You'll recall, if you're a regular listener to my show, that last episode we were reporting from the road. We had begun to board the bus from Atlanta to D.C., and so we reported from the press conference, basically held by many anti-war organizers from across the Deep South to express their reasons for joining the caravan to D.C. to participate in the National March on the White House to oppose the Trump administration's war on Venezuela and the Venezuelan people. So this has now, of course, taken place. This took place, March 16th. And so now I would like to, essentially use this episode to kind of deliver some primary sources, to kind of deliver some of the speeches that were made during the course of the rally in front of the White House before the march essentially made its way to the Trump hotel there or whatnot. So we're going to be hearing directly from so many really amazing anti-war organizers who showed up to be a part of the largest anti-war. Essentially the largest anti-war the largest anti-war rally in favor of Latin America, essentially the largest hands-off Latin America rally to take place in the U.S. In about 30 years. The last time anything like this took place for Latin America was in the 80s. Or the last place something like this took place for Latin America was the 1980s during the the Contra guerrilla warfare that was being at that point promoted and weaponized by the Pentagon against the Sandinistas. So it's been, personally, as an anti-war organizer, it's been really inspiring to see the sort of rebuilding of this this anti-war organization, this anti-war movement, truly popular people's movement that encompasses broad swaths of the U.S. population, as well as of course obviously Latin Americans and Haitians were very prominent during during the Hands Off Venezuela march. And just understanding that, there's definitely something changing. The Trump administration has laid bare how clear its imperial ambitions are in a way that we were not seeing nearly as much with the Obama administration, which is more eloquent. The fact that Donald Trump, tapped Elliot Abrams to be the special envoy to Venezuela when Elliot Abrams himself was implicated and convicted during the Iran-Contra affair. When Elliot Abrams, for instance, has done exactly the same stunt that he pulled in Venezuela previously in Latin America. He has been, he has pulled the exact same stunt of, smuggling arms in to right-wing rebels, under the guise of humanitarian aid in food shipments. So between that and John Bolton, his very obviously transparent quote-unquote troika of tyranny, bringing us back to the days of the axis of evil, it is very clear now what is going on in Venezuela. Even Venezuelan people that I've met who are not necessarily fans of Maduro, or even Venezuelans I've met who hate Maduro, have joined anti-war rallies I've seen, saying U.S. hands off Venezuela, because they say, even though I can't stand Maduro, what the U.S. is doing is so blatantly fascistic that I can't support that anymore. And so there has definitely been a sea change. There's something going on that has not been going on for a very long time, because the Obama administration, for instance, in its 2009 coup against the government of Honduras, was able to, essentially kind of sweep things under the rug in a more competent manner than the Trump administration has been willing to do. We're seeing all of the same tropes. So I'd like to bring people up to speed on generally what the situation in Venezuela has been. I have talked to Venezuelans. I have talked to journalists who have been in the ground in Venezuela, and trying to gather sort of a broader understanding of both what the journalists, what the kind of political analysts, and what Venezuelans themselves think has been happening and is likely to happen. So I would like to back it up a little bit to 2017 when the kind of national media first began focusing on Venezuela. So 2017, it wasn't the first, but the most recent kind of rumblings of another U.S. So-called regime change operation became very apparent as there was a swath of right-wing violence in the country called guarimbas. These flaming barricades that were set up in the streets of major cities like Caracas served essentially as a smokescreen for right-wingers, for kind of the ruling class and generally white Venezuelans, to essentially launch campaigns of violence where they would just to use a couple examples, they would set up like razor wire in order to decapitate motorists. They would throw Molotov cocktails and otherwise fire at military and police installations in Venezuela. And most notably, they were assassinating a lot of indigenous and black Venezuelans, that they suspected to be Chavistas. So the most famous the most infamous assassination would be that of Orlando Figueroa, who was lynched in the streets. He was, doused with gasoline and set on fire by these right wingers, by these guarimba, quote unquote protesters. Orlando and the words he was hearing as he was being burned to death in the streets of Caracas, they were shouting at him, "See, black man, this is what happens this is what happens to Chavistas." So that was the level of 2017, right-wing violence that was going on in the country, that was being reported on so much by alternative media, but that was not making its way to the mainstream and corporate media, the so-called quote-unquote mainstream media. So that, though, largely failed to mobilize any popular movement, and as any such terror campaign does, for instance, 9/11 did here, in fact, brought much of the Venezuelan population who may have been on the fence with Chavismo into the fold of Chavismo, because when you launch a terror campaign to overthrow a government that appears to be sponsored by the U.S., that has all of the markings of the exact same tactics that were used in so many other countries across the world by the CIA, going back to the days of Mossadegh, which we reported on before. When you use those kind of campaigns, it mobilizes the people against you, as it did, for instance, mobilizes the people against that kind of campaign and for whatever government you're trying to take out, as it did, for instance, with the Sandinistas when the U.S. sponsored the Contras. So that having failed in 2017, and with at that point, the Popular Will Party, the far right-wing Popular Will Party being largely, being largely exposed for what it was, being largely delegitimized in the public opinion, it essentially meant that the right-wing opposition to Maduro and to the PSUV had no chance of succeeding electorally. They were so unpopular at that point. They were already very unpopular, but they had no chance of succeeding. So a split opposition, some of them decided to try and run, while others decided to try and boycott. Which, of course, when you have only at most half of an already unpopular opposition attempting to participate in election, that leads to the obvious result, which is that the attempt by Henri Falcón to take the presidency absolutely failed. And it was pretty obvious why it failed, because, again, you had half of them boycotting. But the thing is, this was not a boycott that happened in isolation. This is not a boycott that necessarily, this is not a boycott that had a whole lot of legitimacy to it. The opposition attempted to boycott because they said this is not a legitimate election. The problem with that line of reasoning is that hundreds of international observers, independent international observers from almost every country in the world were watching the elections. The elections were certified by so many different independent organizations to be some of the most free and fair elections in the world. So at the time, this is 2018 now, mid 2018, it appeared that the PSUV won the elections fair and square. The opposition actually said that the UN shouldn't send any international observers because they would, quote unquote, legitimize the election. So the opposition didn't actually want the world to see, that is to say, the right-wing opposition of the Popular Will Party did not actually want the world to see the elections in Venezuela. They're like, no, do not come and do not send anyone to look at these elections. You'll legitimize it. Well, the fact is there were independent observers, again, hundreds of them, from, again, all across the internet, the quote unquote international community. And they all certified that there was no election fraud, no tampering that they could find. So even the U.S., as much as the U.S. was gunning for Venezuela in mid 2018, as much as the kind of right wing, the far right wing ideologues of Donald Trump and John Bolton were really gunning for Venezuela, had no leg to stand on, so that we heard very little about those elections in 2018. Now in 2019, we have seen, of course, Juan Guaido, part of this disgraced the far-right Popular Will Party, attempt to declare himself president by a constitutional mandate that I believe, if you actually look at the constitutional mechanism that he used to quote-unquote declare himself president, that mechanism would have actually put the vice president in power. So Juan Guaido was not even standing on his own constitutional ground there by declaring himself to be president. Then he had 30 days essentially to, he of course immediately fled and began meeting with the right wing. Again, we're talking about the most fascistic people of Ivan Duque in Colombia, and later went to Brazil, where he met with, the Jair Bolsonaro, part of the, we're talking about people who are connected very much to the military dictatorships in their own countries. Bolsonaro, of course, saying that, the problem with the Brazilian military dictatorship was that they didn't kill enough people. He himself was in the military during that dictatorship, and saying that he would rather have among many other horrific statements, saying that we would rather have a dead son than a gay son, etc. So these are the kind of people that the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, has found himself in league with, and Ivan Duque, whose government, if you know anything about the killings of indigenous activists in Colombia, you know that Ivan Duque is likely just as guilty of Bolsonaro of massive crimes against humanity. So meanwhile, as John Bolton has declared this quote unquote troika of tyranny, just as he once declared an axis of evil, same dude, Jesus, they're not even bothering to hide a lot of this anymore. Anyway, as John Bolton, declared the quote unquote troika of tyranny of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, much as he wants to declare the axis of evil as an excuse to invade Iraq, it appears that the real troika of tyranny, the real people who are meddling in stability and democracy in the region, are the U.S., Colombia, and Brazil. And so as Juan Guaido realized he had no support among the base population of Venezuela, as he failed to break off any part of the Venezuelan military or Venezuelan civil government, he was left with no choice but to flee. He attempted to find international support. Very few countries in the world have actually recognized his claim. If you look at a map of the countries, as we talked about in our last episode with Paul Dobson of Venezuela Analysis, the number of countries that have actually recognized the claim of Juan Guaido to the presidency is, I think, less than a quarter of the actual international community. By and large, the international community has continued to recognize the Maduro administration. So as Juan Guaido attempted to re-enter the country, we have a attack on the Venezuela's electrical grid. It seems to have been a cyber attack. You can read so much more about the reporting on the cyber attack by, the Gray Zone Project, by some wonderful, really well, well-versed and really experienced journalists there who have done some good investigative dives into so much of this. The Gray Zone Project reported on the kind of history of attacks on the electrical grids as a pretense to this sort of war. So we saw this. The Venezuelan government has since restored the electrical grid, but it does seem to have been a coordinated attack. And, here we are, to some degree, the attempt at a coup, the attempt of the Trump administration, just the most despicable people on earth, to upend the Venezuelan government and replace it with Juan Guaido, who's already essentially promised to essentially destroy the millions of housing complexes that the Venezuelan government have built for their people, and to essentially destroy as well the CLAP program, which is the massive food programs. He's essentially said that, the Venezuelan government trying to build housing and food for its population is something that he would absolutely reverse those policies. He's the person who clearly does not have the best interests of the Venezuelan people at heart there. He's the one who would clearly starve Venezuelans. Anyway, this coup attempt has largely failed on its face. Juan Guaido is not going to sit as president under kind of the current circumstances. His 30-day constitutional mechanism to call new elections has failed. He has not called new elections. Again, there was a little over half a year between the time the elections actually happened and the time that he said the elections were illegitimate. So what was he doing the rest of that? So that official coup attempt has failed. But that does not mean that Venezuela is on stable ground yet, because the other kind of part of this equation is that the U.S. now appears to be gearing up for paramilitary, terrorist-style and guerrilla war campaigns against the Venezuelan people, similar to, again, what they did with the Contras in Nicaragua. And again, Elliot Abrams himself was part of the Iran-Contra scandal. He was convicted of being a large part of the Contra-style terrorist warfare. So this is not, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's all there in the public record. So this is kind of the current situation in Venezuela. Things seem stable for now. Most of the country, even parts of the country that may have been kind of hesitant to join with Chavismo and with the PSUV, have now found themselves allying with the PSUV strategically against this guerrilla war campaign, which is, popular only with kind of 5 to 10% probably of the Venezuelan population, primarily white Venezuelan businessmen, many of whom are living abroad essentially to protect their assets. And so, that's currently the situation that we face. We are going to continue to cover the anti-war movement as it grows. We are going to continue to cover the situation in Venezuela, but I think that this important setup, this important understanding of how we got to the place that we are, how we got to this particular situation is important, because the days ahead are going to be crucial. The weeks and obviously months ahead and the few years ahead, because again, U.S. kind of imperial strategy thinks not just in years, but in decades. So this is going to be crucial to understand this now, to do the research now, and to understand what has brought us to this point. So again, as part of my quest to continue reporting directly from the front lines, I'd like to dedicate most of this episode to essentially the actual primary source from the March on Washington put on by the Answer Coalition. So we're going to hear a lot of speeches over the next hour. I hope you enjoy. And again, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Radio, 91.7 FM in Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are potted. So stay tuned for some original footage from the Answer Coalition's National March on Washington, which took place on March 16th.
When I say, what side are you on, my people? You say the freedom side. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? On the freedom side. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? On the freedom side. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? On the freedom side. That's right. Thank you all so much for being here. The United States has launched a campaign against Venezuela since its people decided to be free from the imperial rule of the United States. We know that Venezuela is no threat to us. It is simply an example of what people can do when they decide their destiny as a nation building a revolutionary project. While the United States speaks about the need for democracy in Venezuela, the citizens of the United States experience the violence of hyper-surveillance, harassment, and detention. The violence of not having access to clean water, healthy food, quality education, housing, and mental and physical health care. The violence of poverty. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. 95% of the growth in the incarcerated population since 2000 is the result of an increase in the number of unconvicted defendants, many of whom are there because they just can't make bail. So what does the United States possibly know about democracy? Since 2010, 23 states have passed racist voter suppression laws that represent just another barrier for us participating in the political process. As a person who grew up in Florida, I know firsthand how the election was stolen to elect warmonger George W. Bush in 2000, and how the DNC rigged under Zionist Debbie Wasserman Schultz rigged the presidential election in 2016 for warmonger Hillary Clinton. That's right. I recently got back from Venezuela, and what I experienced in my 2 weeks there truly astonished me. While the racist capitalist class declared a humanitarian crisis there, all I could think about is the real humanitarian crisis faced by our people in the United States. I did not even see homeless people in Venezuela. Meanwhile, in the United States, homelessness is growing by leaps and bounds. Today, there are more than 64 million people working for less than $15 an hour, while the top 1% of our country owns more than doubled of 20% of our national income. 13.8 million households in this country face unaffordable water bills, and at least 4 million families with children are being exposed to high levels of lead from drinking water and other sources. Thousands have died every year because some states' decisions to deny Medicaid expansion. More than 250,000 people in the United States die each year from poverty-related causes. We are here to denounce the hypocrisy of the United States government. We are here to say that we will not be complicit in the brutality of this imperialist war machine. There will not be another Iraq. We will not allow for the tentacles of capitalism and imperialism and its systems of oppression to invade, rape, pillage, and exploit. We will not stand by while the U.S. government strangles the economy of the Venezuelan people and steals $7 billion a year to cause civil unrest in Venezuela as a result of basic resources resulting from economic sanctions. Today, we stand in solidarity with Venezuela and its Bolivarian revolution. Today, we defend the people's right to decide their own destiny without any type of U.S. intervention. Venezuela is an example of the power that we have when we align ourselves with the poor and dispossessed over greed and consumption for the sake of the collective future of our society, our precious earth, and our very souls. The same hell that marginalized and poor communities with the United States borders is catching the same hell in the West with the support of the spineless corporate media and a weaponized Silicon Valley that's doling it out to countries around the world. The devastation witnessed in countries like Iraq, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Puerto Rico, whose only real crime is being rich in natural resources, are reasons why we must say hands off Venezuela. And we cannot ever forget Haiti, the first true republic that taught us all about freedom. And they are still suffering the consequences of daring to liberate themselves from the system of enslavement, which fueled the economies of so many imperialist countries in the West. When we say hands off Venezuela, we know that it's to support the democracy in Venezuela, and it also means to support the democracy in Haiti. In the building and sustaining of the workers' political project in Venezuela, they have ensured free education at all levels of engagement of the formal education process. From the beginning of their educational journey, they are supported with free meals, uniforms, textbooks, writing utensils, art supplies, and even a cute little backpack. At the university level, they have access to free public education, daily transportation from even the most rural areas, textbooks, and free food. They have enacted free health care, supplemental income for mothers and families, low-income housing that have allowed families to stay in their communities, and have access to housing in the city at national, state, and local levels with community-based cooperatives. The Bolivarian Revolution is a lighthouse of hope for the continent and for the world. It is a reminder and an affirmation that the people, the poor and dispossessed of this world, are able to organize and build revolutionary projects to imagine our interests and imagine what our future needs to be. We cannot afford to lose Venezuela. So the call is to educate, organize, and mobilize for our communities and to connect the struggles of our people with people around the world. So let's leave this place with a commitment to build solidarity at all levels and continue to denounce and work towards ending the atrocities of this government in the United States, at home and abroad. Thank you so much. Hands up, Venezuela!
Hands up, Venezuela! Venezuela!
Let's show some love for our last speaker one more time. Sisters and brothers, our next speaker is a journalist from the Gray Zone. She's been in Venezuela for the last 3 weeks, combating the lies, combating the hypocrisy, and showing what's really happening in Venezuela. What CNN, Washington Post, the New York Times, what they don't want you to know. She's been out there covering the truth, talking to the people, and demystifying all these lies. Please welcome Anya Parampil.
All right, all right.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many of you from not just Washington, D.C., but around the country to come out here in the belly of the beast this morning and say no to war in Venezuela. I suppose you're thinking the same thing I am, which is that considering the gang that has taken over the White House, anything is possible. I remember when President Trump ran promising to end regime change wars and correctly saying that the war in Iraq was a mistake. And then he turned around and filled the White House up with individuals like John Bolton and Elliot Abrams. People, yeah, you can let them know how we feel. People who have been overthrowing governments and destroying countries for decades. He couldn't even come up with anybody new to do it. And this has created a situation of terror in Venezuela. I can tell you, I was just there. And I spoke with many people who are horrified, actually afraid, that they could soon face a U.S. military intervention. I spoke with one friend, a fellow journalist, who actually broke down crying to me. She said, "We watched the United States destroy Libya. We watched the United States destroy Syria, and I never thought that I would be afraid of the same scenario playing out in my country." That's the level of psychological warfare the United States is already waging on the people there. It's terrifying. We had that conversation about 2 days before the United States did attempt to invade Venezuela. We shouldn't be afraid to say that's what happened on February 23rd, when the U.S. orchestrated a media circus on the border with Colombia with its trucks of humanitarian aid, hoping to create the pretext for further military intervention. It didn't happen because Venezuela was prepared to fight. Venezuela withstood, resisted, and attempted U.S. military intervention. And that's why we're all here to say that we don't want to see any future attempts at that, but we need to recognize that the war on Venezuela is already being waged. It's been waged for years. I don't believe we're going to see, and maybe I'm hopeful, I don't believe we're going to see an Iraq-style invasion happen again, not in Venezuela or anywhere else. Instead, we've entered this new phase of 21st century warfare where the battlefield is in the media and the economy. The United States is waging a war on Venezuela through international capital and finance. I witnessed the effects of this firsthand while I was in Venezuela. We're told that there's a humanitarian crisis. I was in Gaza last year. I saw what a humanitarian crisis looks like, one that is actually enabled by the same government which claims to care about Venezuelans. What I saw in Venezuela was nothing like what I saw in Gaza. However, there is an economic crisis, and that's a direct result, the intentional result of U.S. policy. Yeah. So one final thing I just want to say is that when I was at rallies with the opposition, the people who are now showing up here to try and shut us down, when I was with them in Caracas, they all admitted that their demonstrations were much smaller and weaker than they'd been in years past. But they also all told me that they were confident this time they would see a change in regime. And when I asked them why, it was because they would say, because of Donald Trump and because the United States is backing us in a way they never have before. That told me two things. Juan Guaido will only ride into power in Caracas on the back of a U.S. tank. And the Venezuelan opposition's confidence doesn't come from the streets of Caracas. It comes from the streets of Washington, D.C. But they must have been confused. They must have been thinking about the elites. Because I'm looking at the streets right now and I see people who say no war in Venezuela. We need humanitarian aid here in a country where over 40 million people live in poverty before we start worrying about Venezuela. But we need to be clear. The war on Venezuela has already begun. We need to say, stop the sanctions, end the financial terrorism, and keep our hands off Venezuela. Right? Hands off.
That was Anya Parampilla, the Gray Zone Project. Bookmark that, write it down, or whatever you do. A lot of great reporting coming from there in Venezuela.
Sisters and brothers, just because the CNN and Washington Post, they turned a blind eye towards the history of U.S. intervention, of U.S. aggression and imperialism in Latin America, doesn't mean that we don't know that history, doesn't mean that we've forgotten it. Just because Trump might not actually know it, doesn't mean that our communities haven't experienced it. And our next speakers are going to speak about that history. Please welcome Roberto Villarroel Quesada and Basilio Buendia from El Movimiento al Socialismo Más y PSP from Bolivia.
¡Viva la Coalición de Movimientos Sociales de Estados Unidos! ¡Viva! Reciban ustedes un saludo fraternal y revolucionario de nuestro presidente Evo Morales de Bolivia.
Hi. We send you comradely greetings from Bolivia. English is shorter.
Compañeros, es irresponsable tomar por la fuerza un país que ha decidido democráticamente ser feliz.
It's irresponsible to think that you can go into another country and intervene when on their happiness.
Las desestabilizaciones informáticas que hoy está generando la oposición lo hace tan irresponsable porque quieren tomar las riquezas de nuestra querida Venezuela.
The destabilization that's happening in Venezuela is irresponsible, and it's only because they want to exploit the resources of Venezuela.
No podemos permitir que un irresponsable como Guaidó asuma la economía ilegal de los fondos de Venezuela.
We can't allow an irresponsible person like Guaidó to allow the exploitation and the theft of the resources of Venezuela.
Sabemos que el socialismo ha tenido éxito a través de la administración política, económica y social de nuestro presidente indígena Evo Morales.
We know that socialism has benefited our people in Venezuela. The work of Evo Morales has benefited our communities.
Ahora se reúnen los países neoliberales que hoy están matando de hambre a todo Argentina, Brasil, Ecuador, Lima y todos los países que con administraciones neoliberales no asumen una responsabilidad social.
Now these neoliberals are organizing against Latin America. They're organizing against Argentina. They're organizing against Brazil and South America. And we have to say no.
¡Viva la unidad de los estadounidenses laborales!
Long live the solidarity in the United States!
¡Evo! 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 Un saludo fraterno de parte de los representantes que aquí estamos presentes, los bolivianos. A nombre de Bolivia, ¡viva Evo Morales!
Comradely greetings from us in Venezuela. From Bolivia, our sisters and brothers in Bolivia. Comradely greetings to the United States.
Aquí estamos los originarios indígenas dándoles superioridad, gobernando a todos los países neoliberales para poder sacar adelante todos los pobres del mundo.
Here we are, indigenous people, showing that we can govern, showing the rest of the world, putting the world to shame, and governing our own countries.
Bolivia está capacitada política y sindicalmente, porque nosotros, los bolivianos, hemos sufrido en sangre propia, porque allá en Bolivia había hambre, miseria, tortura, golpes de Estado. Ya no queremos más golpes de Estado en ningún otro país del mundo.
In Bolivia, we've suffered hunger, we've suffered from coups, we've suffered from the brutality, from the torture, but not anymore. We're putting a stop to that.
Por eso el Estado plurinacional de Bolivia hoy en día es de las mejores de la región económicamente. 6 años consecutivos con la mejor economía.
That is why our government in Bolivia is so strong right now. That is why our economy is growing and strengthening because of these policies.
También tenemos riqueza. Por eso a Bolivia también no sé qué sorpresas tendrán. Pero el boliviano está preparado para defender hasta con la muerte.
And we have resources. And more importantly, we have people who are willing to sacrifice their lives for their freedom.
¡Viva Venezuela! ¡Viva Bolivia! Venezuela no está solo, estamos aquí para defender.
Long live Venezuela! Venezuela is not alone. We are here to support you.
Hands off! Hands off! Hands off! Hands off!
Thank you again from the comrades from Bolivia, which is continuing to fight, along with the other ALBA countries, along with many of the tiny Caribbean islands. Next, I want to bring all the way from Boston, Teresa, who's an activist there, working with the Answer Coalition, and is also a Venezuelan. Welcome, Teresa. I'm sorry.
Hi, everyone. I was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela until the age of 10. As a proud Venezuelan, I'm here today to stand in solidarity with the working class people in my country. I am here to honor our history, our people, and the legacy of all freedom fighters that have come before us. I'm not here today to speak for the masses in Venezuela, but rather to connect their struggle here in the U.S. with the Venezuelan people on the ground, organizing en los barrios y en las comunas. In 1989, working class Venezuelans went out to protest to what was called El Caracazo against the neoliberal policies that led to increasing gas prices and bus fares. Today, we see the elites attempting to reestablish the same oppressive system of domination and exploitation that gave rise to the Bolivarian Revolution, one that has fought for over 20 years, with over 500 years of anti-colonial legacy since Huaycaipuro. The Bolivarian Revolution substantially decreased poverty and homelessness alongside building free public education for all Venezuelans. Even through the conditions of crippling sanctions and economic war since the Obama administration, the people continue to build and organize. So we stand here today in solidarity with the Venezuelan people that continue to fight for that same independent and sovereign nation that Simón Bolívar wanted us to have. La Revolución Bolivariana has historically stood strongly and unapologetically in solidarity with the oppressed people of the global South and the entire continent of Aviala. The resistance we see today and every day from the Venezuelan people against imperialism and world oppression is one that continues to inspire the oppressed nations everywhere. Chavez always stood in solidarity with the Palestinians, the people of Puerto Rico, Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and many more. We must continuously speak up against attempts from the U.S. to overthrow leftist governments across the global South, alongside building revolutionary power that aims to build a world without war and exploitation, a world for all of us. It only requires us to look at history to know that the U.S. has funded military coups across our people's nations. The 1954 U.S. funded military coup in Guatemala. The 1973 military U.S.-backed coup in Chile, killing socialist President Salvador Allende and bringing the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. The 1979 U.S. funded Contra-war in Nicaragua in opposition to the Socialist Sandinista National Liberation Front. It is imperative that we as communities and individuals recognize the connections and systems of imperialism, capitalism, and settler colonialism that fails to recognize the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Saco, Massachusetts, the one that gentrifies communities in Dorchester, Harlem, and Congress Heights, are the same ones that force families and children in Central America to flee war and migrate here to the U.S. We must, without a doubt, organize and educate our communities about the struggles in our own neighborhood and those abroad. We must connect our struggles, unite, and fight alongside our comrades, siblings, and families for our collective freedom. The fight for global liberation here and everywhere must be rooted in anti-colonial struggle. And today, all of us stand here with the Venezuelan people that continue to fight for a just world, one rooted in deep revolutionary consciousness. In the words of Angela Davis, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Aquí seguiremos colectivamente expresando la solidaridad con el pueblo venezolano, con los trabajadores, obreros, campesinos, los pueblos originarios, revolucionarios y luchadores de la raíces en un pueblo consciente, un pueblo en lucha por un buen vivir, soberano e independiente. Y eso es lo que demandamos para todos, sin sanciones ni golpes de estados. Let us continue to stand here in utter solidarity with the people of Venezuela, the workers, farmers, native peoples, revolutionaries and fighters of the Bolivarian Revolution. Our revolution is rooted in a conscious people, a people in struggle for a good life, for a sovereign and independent nation, and that is what we demand for all. Que viva Venezuela, que viva la revolución bolivariana y que vivan los pueblos luchadores y trabajadores del mundo, hoy y siempre. Gracias.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Give it up for Teresa.
You are currently listening to speeches from the rally at the beginning of the Answer Coalition's national march on the White House that took place on March 16th. This is an important kind of step forward in the anti-war movement in the U.S. as we start to bring together, a more broad coalition of people who understand what's at stake and who are not going to be fooled again by sort of the Obama administration style putting of a quote unquote humanitarian spin on what is in fact Pentagon regime change operations. We reported directly from the front line by essentially getting these recordings of all of these wonderful anti-war organizers. I hope you're enjoying. And I just want to remind everybody, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM, Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM, New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded.
Sisters and brothers, I want you to please give a warm welcome our next speaker. We're so honored to have today a longtime activist and leader with the Black Alliance for Peace. Please make some noise for Nefa Freeman.
Greetings, sisters and brothers. I'm actually here to give a statement on behalf of our brother Jamal Baraka, the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, who can't be here today because he's trapped in Venezuela. He went there on a delegation, and, well, you'll hear about what happened in the statement. So on behalf of Jamal Baraka, comrades, brothers, and sisters, I bring you revolutionary greetings from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on this day of struggle and resistance as we collectively call for all power to the people. I wish that I could have been there physically today, but in a cowardly act of imperialist intrigue, the pilots of American Airlines joined the U.S. State Department in its efforts to create the impression of crisis in Venezuela. And so now members of our peace delegation have been forced to seek alternative paths back to the U.S. that will take literally days. But the story today is not about us. It's about you gathered in a fundamental solidarity with the struggling people of Venezuela. With your presence, you have struck a blow against the myth that all sectors of the population support the mad plans of Trump and its supporters in the Democratic Party. With your presence today, it will be a reminder to the people of Venezuela who we made aware of today's event that you are standing with them. With your presence, you say to the world that there are people in this country, this plantation, that understand the historic task to resist from the belly of the beast the bloodthirsty plans of the predatory colonial imperialist U.S., European Union, NATO axis of domination. Over the course of the last few days, our delegation has seen much, but we did not see a crisis in the government of Venezuela. The crisis that we did see in Venezuela is not the crisis of socialism or the Bolivarian process. What we saw was the crisis of imperialism, an imperialism unable to conquer and humiliate and degrade the proud people of Venezuela. We want to thank the Answer Coalition for its leadership pulling this together and call on all to join the Black Alliance for Peace in all forces to continue to concentrate our forces in order to better organize the resistance to U.S. imperialism. Black Alliance for Peace will be back in D.C. in 2 weeks as we focus our resistance until March 30th to to the link between NATO and Venezuela as we target the insulting decision by NATO to commemorate its 70th anniversary, April 4th, on the day that they struck down Dr. Martin Luther King in Memphis. Please continue to support Black Alliance for Peace program to shut down AFRICOM and our upcoming campaign that will launch April 4th, highlighting the link between U.S. militarism abroad and the war being waged against black and brown people and working class domestically. We say at the Black Alliance for Peace, not one drop of blood of black and brown people and the working class to defend the interests of capitalist dictatorship. Make the issue of war and U.S. imperialism the litmus test for who is really a progressive in the United States. Stand for justice, fight for peace, victory until death. Ajamo Baraka, Caracas, Venezuela.
Thank you again, Max, for everything you've done. Next, I want to bring someone who has also been working diligently, but often very humorously as well, to explode so many of the lies that have existed around Venezuela and so much else that the oligarchic people in charge of the so-called politicians have done. I want to bring up Lee Camp to say a few words for us. Good to see you, brother. What's up, man?
Hello, thank you for being out here. You pumped up? You pumped up? You excited to march? We're going to march here in a minute. You ready? All right, I'm going to keep this very short. I think there's like one speaker after me, and then we're getting out of here. We're going to start moving it down the streets, because these are our streets. It's so exciting to be here, and honestly, this may seem like a dire time. They're pushing another war. They want to upend another country. And by the way, ask these people which country it is that U.S. has screwed with, has with, that they want Venezuela to end up like. Do they want it to be Syria? Do they want it to be Libya? Do they want it to be Iraq? Is that what they want? The U.S. has not done any good for those countries that we have upended. Okay? And furthermore, the fake facade of the reasons that we want to go in and upend Venezuela and create our U.S.-backed coup, it's all fallen away. The fake reasons are gone. So now you have John Bolton saying on Fox News that it's for the oil, all right? It's for the oil. It's for the power. It's not even, they can't even cover it up anymore. Like, they don't even know how to fake it. Like, for God's sakes, become better liars. Anyway, this is huge. You guys should be really excited, and we're gonna end this coup right now. All right, because the people of Venezuela should decide their fate, not the people in that building right there. All right, you ready to march? Who streets? Who streets? Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Redacted Tonight. That's his show. I forgot to say it. Watch it every day.
Who streets? Who streets? Sisters and brothers, our last speaker is the physical representation of that saying. This woman has dedicated her entire life for fighting not just against U.S. wars abroad, but for fighting for people here, fighting for jobs, fighting for education, fighting for immigrant rights. Gloria La Riva, from the Cuba-Venezuela Solidarity Committee. She just came back. She spent a month in Venezuela. And she spent decades all over Cuba, all over the world, all over Latin America. She was on the bridge when those traitors were trying to get the U.S. to come in and to invade, when they bombed their own trucks, just as an excuse, as a pretext to bring in more foreign military into Latin America. When those traitors were there, Gloria La Riva was there too. And she's been talking to people for the last month, and she's been organizing. And let's put your hands together, please, for Gloria La Riva.
Sisters and brothers, it's a great day today because we and people around the world are marching for Venezuela. I had the great privilege to be there during the blackout that took place. I was due to fly out at 7 p.m. Thursday. I was at the airport and the lights went out at 5. And I thought something happened at the airport. But within an hour, it was clear it was the whole country. And it was shocking because we knew that we're in the middle of this aggression by the United States and wondered what's going to happen. Is there going to be bombing? Is there going to be troops? Is something else going to happen? What's going to happen to President Nicolas Maduro? We spent the night wondering. And then, just like the sun comes up every day, the people came out. It was a normal day. They went and did their work. It was not easy because they couldn't buy on their debit card the food that they needed. It wasn't easy because you had no communications. I took a moto taxi at 7 a.m. to the presidential palace because I figured there might be electricity there. And there was emergency power. And found out that it wasn't sabotage. This is what happened. And it kept happening. These heroic workers kept bringing back the power. And then it would fall another hour and back up again. And today, I heard from my friend in Venezuela because someone told me, a reporter said they heard that there's still a blackout there. He said, no, the power is restored. But the terrorists bombed an electrical plant in a middle-class neighborhood. Terrorism. And in fact, there was a press conference by Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, together with the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Moscow, because Venezuela announced that their oil offices in Europe are moving to Moscow. They have to protect themselves. And Lavrov said the U.S. is buying weapons and shipping them to Venezuela, to Brazil, and to Colombia. What they plan is partly a paramilitary war. The danger is on. When I was at the bridge of Tienditas on February 23rd with hundreds of young people ready to fight and defend their country, Freddy Bernal, the chief protector of Táchira State, because it's a dangerous area, he told the people, nerves of steel. Nerves of steel. We will not fall into violence with the opposition. We will not let the U.S. have an excuse. And so today when we march, let's march solidly together. Pay attention. Make sure that we're militant, that we march at the whole city of Washington and the world hears us. Minimize your telephone stuff, okay? Let's look really strong, sisters and brothers, because we represent a lot more people than who could come here today, and we're great. The danger is there as long as U.S. imperialism exists. But we have more power than their bombs and their economic power. We have the people, and the people are waking up in this country. And I'll tell you, when Trump said to the military, you better come over to our side, or you're going to lose everything. No, if they went to their side, they would lose their homeland. And it didn't happen. So let's stay strong. Let's fight. U.S. hands off Venezuela. And I salute President Nicolas Maduro and all the revolutionaries.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.